This being said, I will try to present my talk in very little time. I will start with a few remarks. Well, first I want to thank UNESCO for bringing us together, and I want to highly recommend the paper written by Christina. It's the first paper in the big binder that was given to you. I found it extremely illuminating. And as a Canadian, I look forward to getting Catherine's paper and learning more about the work they've been doing. So I want to start with a short remark on culture and poverty. UNESCO's report in 2009 had as a topic the role of cultural diversity in poverty eradication. And in that context, I wrote a piece that was also presented in a congressional hearing in DC on how does culture matter for poverty. In the US, there's an enormous amount of reluctance to talk about the ways in which culture feeds poverty, simply because we have this wonderful or really terrible history with blaming the victim. When we talk about the ways in which worldviews are feeding into the reproduction of poverty, very quickly social scientists are being blamed for being conservative. So when we talk about poverty, it's always very, very fraught. The paper that I wrote with my colleague, Mario Small, was meant to detail the ways in which social scientists are now talking about poverty in ways that are very different from what was happening in the 60s, with concepts such as frames, narrative, institutions, boundaries, identity, which are really meant to illuminate the ways in which low-income population are thinking about hope, are thinking about shared aspirations. So it is not only about the ways in which some values are reproducing the cycle of poverty, but also how people are capable of imagining alternative futures. So I want to signal this as a point of introduction. My two colleagues on the panel are the indicators expert. I'm not an indicator expert. I'm someone who has been thinking about how can we conceptualize societal success. And this topic is of relevance to our session today because before deciding how to measure, we need to decide what to measure. And in many ways, my perspective on this resembles the ones that have been promoted by the two previous speakers. Building on the 2004 Human Development Report, I really want to emphasize the importance of looking here at the building of culturally diverse society, which is manifested in part through the construction of strong group identities and also through cultural expression, two themes that are very much at the center of the meetings here. These are complement to the economic approaches to sustainable development. We don't want to deny the relevance of economics here, but economics doesn't mean much if we cannot also think about the construction of strong collective imaginaries, including shared sense of hope and collective capabilities. The 2004 Human Development Report, in my perspective, had too much of a focus on cultural freedom and choice. The capacity for people to engage in forms of cultural participation or identity that they value, as inspired by the very important work of Ahmed Sam. But I want to emphasize, instead of individual choice, I want to emphasize what the environment in which people live empowers. So in this research team I've been involved with, we've produced two books, The Social Resilience in Successful Societies, and in both cases we're looking at the institutional tools and the cultural repertoires that are put at the disposal of members of societies to face the challenges that are presented to them. So here the answer is not only what individuals want, but also what is empowered, what are they empowered to do, given the role of institutions in their lives, how resources are distributed, but also how institutions and cultural repertoires promote a more inclusive understanding of us. So here we're talking about the politics of redistribution, distribution of resources, of income, for instance, to low-income population, but also very much the politics of recognition, that is destigmatization. The poverty of low-income population is only half of the problem. The other half is how poverty is construed. Whether the poor are understood to be victims of the market or whether the poor are taken to be moral failures. So there are tools that can be put, that can be activated for lowering the stigmatization of low-income population, and I propose that we need to think about this more systematically when we think about collective indicators of well-being. The Economist last week had a very lengthy discussion of how the new leaders of China are now promoting the Chinese dream as a parallel to the American dream. And the Chinese dream is very important for what it empowers. So here we're talking about the cultural imaginaries that are offered to population to give them a collective sense of who we are, what is the collective past, what are our hopes, what can we achieve together. So these notions of collective selves empower collective capabilities, and that's only one of the reasons why they are so important. One of my colleagues in Successful Societies has studied the role of chiefs in Malawi in mobilizing population to achieve collective goals. In part through normative control, deciding which funerals you're going to attend, sends very clear messages about what is normatively expected in the community. And that is the kind of cultural constructs that we need to think about when we're looking at collective definition of well-being. And I must say that in the praise of development economics doing randomized trials currently in Africa, these collective normative structures are totally bypassed and ignored. So it's important at this point to remember their importance. So what are we going to build on if we want to look at measurements of well-being? Christina has mentioned a very important work that is currently being conducted, the 2012 Chile indicators, which focus on a holistic approach to well-being, or the Australian Victoria Community Indicators, which measure community well-being, not only health and resilience, but also cultural vibrancy. So to me, these seem to be very promising. I also want to bring to your attention the work of Roberto Foa and Jeffrey Tanner, who developed composite social development indicators, which have a clear institutional focus, looking, for instance, at the strength of civil societies, intergroup relations, and gender equality. But in my view, these indicators don't go far enough. They're very much grounded in economic institutionalism, and they privilege a focus on how institutions empower economic growth. Instead, again, we need to look independently at recognition and distribution as dimensions of societal success. We need not only, and this we've heard a lot about this morning, not only engage in celebrations of diverse cultural expressions, but also look at the capacity of groups to define a sense of worth and dignity that is autonomous from dominant criteria of evaluation. So low-income populations suffer, may not only lack resources, but also they might also suffer because they're construed as worthless. But we need to think about the pluralism or plurality of ways of evaluating one's work that is not typically tapped by these indicators. For instance, whether one has a strong sense of worth due to their capacity to be there for their friends and family. Professor Clément Mbaum was mentioning earlier the importance of amour, community, as alternative sources of worth. So I think that these dimensions are often neglected, and they act as an alternative matrix by which people might measure their worth. You're not necessarily a loser because you don't have money, and this is something that often escapes the economists who are working in these, who are developing indices. So we also need to tap the institutional conditions that favor recognition. I want to mention briefly the work of Will Kimlicka and Banting, who have developed this multicultural index, which measures the extent to which OECD countries are adopting policies that favor diversity, that send to ethnic minorities clear messages about their worth in the polity. So for instance, whether bilingual language courses are offered to new immigrants, etc. The work of Irene Bloomrath has showed that societies that rank very high on this multicultural index have immigrants who are much more cognitively and emotionally committed to their receiving country, and they are much more likely also to run for election. So there's a real payoff. If a country sends to their minority groups a message that they are valued members, these members in turn invest more strongly in their receiving, in their host society. So I think that this message can be extended to other population, including low-income population. So given that time is short, I think I will stop there. I will simply conclude by saying that we should go beyond do-goodism here. It is not only the issue of the relation between culture and poverty is not only about delighting in our differences. It's very much to be aware that these questions of stigmatization are power relationships, and that in order to change them, we need to approach them with much more vigor than is usually the case. In engineering group boundaries, when we're talking about race, intergroup boundaries or boundaries between low-income populations and other populations, is absolutely not easy because it's part of the fundamental processes around which societies organize themselves. But the first step is certainly to open the dialogue and talk very explicitly about problems that are connected not only to distribution but also to the recognition of low-income populations.